Poor Waitress says, "Sir, that's my dad's signature." Billionaire CEO drops his glass in shock. The room went silent, not the gentle hush you hear before a toast, but the sharp, stunned kind of silence that drops like a blade. Every eye turned toward the table in the corner, where a billionaire CEO sat frozen, his hand trembling, crystal glass slipping from his fingers. It shattered against the polished floor, red wine bleeding across marble like a crime scene. And all because a waitress, just a girl in a black apron with tired eyes, had whispered, "Sir, that's my dad's signature." You could cut the tension with the shards at his feet. He looked at her, pale, blinking as if he'd seen a ghost. In a way, he had. Because what Daniel Harrington didn't realize was that the past he buried, the family he'd ruined to build his empire, was standing right in front of him, tray in hand. Now, here's the thing. At first glance, you might think this is just workplace drama. A bold waitress, a careless remark, a rich man embarrassed at dinner. But no, this wasn't petty. This wasn't accidental. This was the moment a long-forgotten wound was ripped open, and trust me, the fallout wasn't measured in spilled wine. See, Emma wasn't just any waitress. She was the daughter of a man who once stood shoulder to shoulder with giants. Her father had built skyscrapers, bridges, and a reputation that was untouchable. Until Daniel Harrington came along. One forged contract, one damning rumor, and overnight Emma's dad went from respected architect to pariah. His career destroyed, his name dragged through the mud, his family left with nothing. And while Emma worked double shifts to keep the lights on, Daniel sat in glass towers, sipping wine, building his empire on ashes that weren't his to claim. Issa, when fate, or maybe karma, placed them in the same room again, it wasn't coincidence. It was collision. Emma didn't plan the words that spilled out of her mouth, but once they were spoken, they couldn't be taken back. And Harrington, for the first time in years, the man with limitless power, was caught off guard. This story isn't about spilled wine or dinner gossip. It's about corruption, betrayal, and the quiet strength of someone the world underestimated. And over the next 45 minutes, you'll see how one young woman challenged a billionaire who thought he was untouchable. Spoiler, he wasn't. But before we dive in, let me pause here. If you love stories where justice isn't just served, it's chilled, plated with silver, and delivered to the very people who thought they'd never taste it, then you're in the right place. Go ahead and hit subscribe. These videos take hours of digging, writing, editing, and, let's be honest, recovering from the second-hand rage of it all. So your support, it means more than you know. All right, now let's rewind. Because to understand why that glass fell, why a single sentence could unmake a billionaire, you need to know what happened years before. You need to know what Daniel stole, and what Emma was about to take back, before Emma became the waitress who stopped a billionaire in his tracks. She was simply her father's daughter. And to understand the weight of what she said that night, you have to know who he was before it all came crashing down. Her father, Richard Lawson, wasn't just an architect. He was the architect, the kind of man whose name carried weight in elite circles, whispered with respect at black-tie galas. His buildings weren't just structures, they were statements. Glass towers that glittered against city skylines, bridges that seemed to float on air. People used to say Richard could sketch a future on the back of a napkin and make it real within a year, and Emma worshipped him for it. As a little girl, she'd sit at his drafting table, legs swinging, listening as he explained why good architecture wasn't just about steel and glass, it was about trust. Every building is a promise, he'd say, and people put their lives inside promises. But promises can be stolen. It started quietly. A rumor here, a headline there, whispers that Richard had cut corners, forged documents, signed contracts he shouldn't have. At first, people dismissed it because Richard Lawson wasn't that man. But then came the evidence. Pages of contracts, stamped and signed with his name. Deals no one remembered him making. Clauses that shifted millions of dollars out of thin air. depressed her into him. Colleagues vanished overnight, pretending they'd never shaken his hand. And the people he thought were friends, they didn't just abandon him, they turned on him, pointing fingers to protect themselves. Within weeks, his firm collapsed. His licenses were revoked. His reputation, once untouchable, was reduced to a single word: fraud. Emma was 17 when she saw her father come home for the last time with his box of office things. Notebooks, blueprints, a photo of her family smiling at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. He placed it all on the kitchen table like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She remembered the silence. Her MOM staring at the floor. Her dad whispering, "It's not mine." That signature, "It's not mine." But no one cared. The world had already decided he was guilty, and guilt is expensive. Lawsuits drained the family dry. The house went next, then the car. By the time Emma turned 18, she was working nights just to keep food on the table. College became a dream she folded up and tucked away, because survival came first. What hurt the most wasn't the money, though. It was the shame. The way neighbors avoided their eyes at the grocery store. The way teachers stopped calling on Emma in class, as if her father's scandal made her invisible. One day, she overheard a customer sneer. "That Lawson girl, her dad's a fraud, right?" She smiled politely while her chest burned, because correcting them didn't matter. No one believed her anyway. So Emma learned to live small, to fade into the background. She took whatever jobs she could find: hostess, barista, eventually waitress at one of the very restaurants her father used to dine in with clients. Talk about irony. She used to walk through those doors in patent leather shoes, clutching her dad's hand, feeling like she belonged. Now she slipped in through the back entrance in non-slip sneakers, carrying trays for the same people who once toasted her family's success. She didn't complain though. She couldn't, because bills don't wait, because her MOM had cracked under the pressure, retreating into herself, leaving Emma as the one who kept things together. She worked double shifts, smiled through exhaustion, and swallowed her pride so her family could keep surviving. And still, she held onto one stubborn truth: her dad hadn't lied. That signature wasn't his. The world could call him a fraud, but she knew better. She saw the way his hands trembled when he looked at the papers. She saw the devastation in his eyes, the look of a man who'd been erased by someone else's pen. Every tray she carried, every rude remark she ignored. Emma did it with that truth in her chest. But she also carried a question, a quiet, gnawing question that lived in the back of her mind. Who forged it? Who wanted her father destroyed so badly that they burn a good man to the ground? She didn't have an answer yet. All she had was the weight of a fallen name and the determination to carry it. Have you ever had to carry the weight of your family's struggles on your shoulders? Share your story. If Emma's father's downfall had a face, it wore $1,000 suit and the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes. Daniel Harrington, billionaire CEO, a man who built his empire on polished lies and perfectly staged press photos. He was the kind of person who entered a room and instantly changed the air. Conversations hushed, waiters stiffened, and people leaned in like moths to a flame. Tall, lean, silver haircut to precision, he had the look of someone who knew he was untouchable. Ruthless didn't even begin to cover it. Emma had heard the name for years, whispered like a curse in her household. Harrington was rumored to be the shadow behind her father's fall, the one who'd whispered to investors, the one who quietly fed the press, the one who made sure Richard Lawson's reputation didn't just stumble, but shattered. But whispers aren't proof, and Emma had long since learned that in a world like his, proof is the only currency that matters. Still, when he walked into the restaurant that evening, something inside her twisted. She was balancing a tray of water glasses, but her hands went cold. Harrington was seated at the best table, of course the corner booth overlooking the skyline. He didn't ask for it. He didn't need to. The manager practically tripped over himself to make sure Harrington's party got whatever they wanted. Emma kept her head down. Because that was her job. Smile, serve, disappear. Yet, no matter how she tried, she couldn't shake the sense that fate had just dealt her a loaded hand. The first interaction was small. She poured his wine, and Harrington didn't even glance at her. Just a flick of his fingers, dismissing her presence like she was part of the decor. She'd been invisible before, but with him, it cut deeper. After all, wasn't this the man who had made her entire family invisible? She returned to the table again and again, plates, glasses, napkins folded with precision. Each time, she caught fragments of his conversation. Arrogant laughter, words sharp enough to slice. Harrington was talking about liars and parasites, about people who think they can cheat their way to the top. Emma's chest tightened. One of his companions chuckled. "You've always had a way of cleaning house, Daniel," and Harrington smirked. "That's why I'm still here, and they're not. Weak men sign things they don't understand. Then they cry foul when it ruins them. I don't clean out liars, I expose them," the table laughed. It was the kind of laugh Emma had grown up hearing at fundraisers. The laugh of men who believed the world was theirs to cover up. Her hands shook as she placed a dish in front of him. But no one noticed. No one ever noticed. She could have screamed in his face, and he probably would have brushed it off as background noise. And then it happened. Harrington pulled out a leather folder, sliding papers across the table like trophies. "Here," he said, tapping a signature at the bottom. "This is how you handle business." One clean stroke of a pen, and a man is finished. Emma froze. The tray in her hand grew heavy. Her eyes locked on the page on the scroll at the bottom. It wasn't just familiar. It was identical. Her father's signature. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, the restaurant blurred. She could hear her father's voice, years ago, whispering at the kitchen table, "It's not mine. That signature, it's not mine." And now, here it was, in Harrington's hands, marked, flaunted, paraded like a trophy kill. Emma's pulse hammered. She felt heat rush to her cheeks, and her vision tunneled. Every instinct screamed at her to speak, to point at the paper, to shout, to tell the whole room that this was the proof her family had been destroyed by lies. But then reality cut in. She was a waitress, just a girl with an apron and a paycheck that barely covered rent. Harrington was a billionaire with lawyers, PR teams, and an empire built on crushing anyone who dared stand in his way. What could she do? What could she say? She gripped the tray so tightly her knuckles ached. Her mind spun in circles. If she stayed quiet, Harrington would keep laughing, keep winning, keep living untouched while her father withered under the weight of a false accusation. But if she spoke, if she called him out here and now, what would it cost her? Her job, her safety, the last shred of stability she'd managed to build. The tray trembled in her hands. Harrington kept talking, oblivious. "You see, gentlemen, the truth is simple. Power belongs to the man holding the pen. Everything else is noise. Noise. That's all she was to him. That's all her father had become. Noise to be silenced." Emma swallowed hard. Her throat burned with unshed words. She wanted to scream that her father wasn't a liar, that he hadn't signed those papers, that the only fraud at the table was the man smirking over his wine glass. But all she did, in that moment, was breathe. Breathe and tremble, and hold the truth like a live wire in her chest, because sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes silence is the moment before the storm. The restaurant that night was a study in quiet elegance. Low golden lights draped the room in warmth. Violins whispered faintly from hidden speakers, and crystal glasses clinked in a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. It was the kind of place where conversations never rose above a polished murmur, where power dressed itself in velvet and silver, and at the center of it all sat Daniel Harrington. He leaned back in his chair like a king at a feast, commanding attention without lifting a finger. His companions hung on every word, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, nodding at pronouncements that weren't profound. He gestured with his wineglass, red liquid swirling like blood in the candlelight. Emma moved silently between tables, her black apron tied tight, tray balanced on one hand. To everyone else, she was invisible, but inside, she was unraveling. Every step toward his table, every fragment of his smug voice, felt like salt in an open wound. And that signature, the one he had so carelessly flaunted, burned itself into her mind. She set a plate down, forcing her hands to stay steady. Harrington didn't glance up. Why would he? To him, she was just another nameless server, another face in the background. But then he said it. You want to know the secret? His voice cut through the chatter, low but sharp. It's not talent. It's not even hard work. It's knowing when to strike. You take a man's signature, and you take his future. Simple as that. Laughter erupted at the table. Glasses clinked in approval. Emma's heart pounded so loudly she was sure someone could hear it. Her vision tunneled. She wasn't standing in a restaurant anymore. She was 17 again, at her kitchen table, watching her father whisper through tears that the signature wasn't his. Watching him crumble while the world called him a fraud, the words rose in her throat before she could stop them. They weren't planned. They weren't polished. They were raw, jagged, impossible to hold back. Sir? Her voice cracked, but it cut through the laughter like glass shattering. Every head at the table turned. Harrington's brow furrowed, as if realizing for the first time that the waitress had a voice. Emma's hands shook, but her eyes locked on the page in front of him. She swallowed and said it louder, clearer. That's my dad's signature. The words hung in the air, heavy, immovable, for a beat. The restaurant kept moving. Forks scraped plates. Wine poured. But then the silence spread, rippling outward until the entire room froze. Harrington blinked. His grip tightened around his glass, and then crack, the stem snapped in his hand. Red wine spilled down his cuff, dripping onto the marble floor. The crystal shattered at his feet, the sound ricocheting through the silence. Gasps erupted. Diners craned their necks. Emma stood rooted in place, trembling but unflinching. Harrington didn't move. His eyes, sharp and cold, locked on hers as though trying to size her up, trying to remember if he'd ever seen her before. His lips parted, but no words came. For once, Daniel Harrington, the man who never faltered, never flinched, was speechless. Emma's chest heaved. She wanted to shrink, to vanish into the floorboards. But another part of her, the part that had carried her family shame for years, refused to look away. No one spoke. No one dared. Even the violins seemed to fall silent. Finally, Harrington let out a short, brittle laugh, though it didn't reach his eyes. What did you say? Emma swallowed hard. Her voice trembled, but her words didn't. That signature. She nodded toward the paper on the table. It belongs to my father, Richard Lawson. And I know, because I've seen it 1,000 times. The weight of her declaration pressed down on the room. Forks stilled in midair. Whispers stirred at nearby tables. Harrington leaned back slowly, jaw tight, the mask of effortless composure slipping by degrees. His companions exchanged uneasy glances, sensing something they couldn't quite name. Emma's knees threatened to buckle. Her palms were damp, but she held her ground. For years, she'd swallowed her voice, buried her truth. Not tonight. The silence stretched, taut as wire. Harrington's smile twitched, faltered, disappeared. For the first time in public memory, the man looked cornered, and as Emma stood there, breathless and defiant, she realized something extraordinary. Power wasn't always about money or titles. Sometimes it was about a single sentence spoken at the right time. From that moment, the mask began to crack. If you were Emma, would you have spoken up or stayed quiet to keep your job? Emma didn't sleep that night. How could she? The sound of that glass shattering replayed in her mind, over and over, like a warning bell that wouldn't stop ringing. Harrington's face frozen. then cracking burned behind her eyelids. She had spoken the truth out loud, but words were only sparks. If she wanted fire, she needed proof, and so she began to dig dirty first. It was just her father's old study, untouched since the day he disappeared. Dust clung to every corner, the faint smell of tobacco still hanging in the curtains. Emma pulled open drawers and rifled through boxes, her fingers shaking with every page she turned. Blueprints, letters, contracts with red stamps across them void. Then, tucked inside a manila folder at the very bottom of a cabinet, she found it, her father's handwriting in a shaky scrawl. "They're watching. Trust no one. Keep the originals safe." The words chilled her. She remembered him saying something similar once, late at night, his voice hushed like someone might be listening through the walls. She'd thought it was paranoia. Now it felt like prophecy. Flashbacks bled through her exhaustion. She saw him hunched over the kitchen table, rubbing his temples, whispering, "They want it all. Emma, every design, every deal. If I fight them, they'll bury me." At the time, she hadn't understood. She was too young, too desperate to believe he could still protect them. Now she understood all too well. But documents alone weren't enough. She needed witnesses, people who'd seen what Harrington had done, that led her to her father's old firm, a glass tower in the city, polished to a shine that mocked everything it had stolen. Emma walked in with her head down, a waitress's paycheck folded in her purse, and asked to speak with anyone who remembered Richard Lawson. Most brushed her off. Fear had a way of erasing memory. But one man, Mr. Patel, an engineer with kind eyes and tired shoulders, hesitated. He closed his office door behind them and lowered his voice. "Your father was a good man. Too good for Harrington. He wouldn't sign what they wanted. He wouldn't approve the shortcuts, the cost-cutting. They forged his name, Emma. And when he tried to fight it," Patel's voice trailed off, heavy with shame, "they made sure no one would listen." Emma's throat tightened. She asked if Patel had proof, anything concrete. He shook his head, regret carved deep into his face. But then he added, "There are others. People who left rather than be part of it. Quiet people like me. But they remember." And so Emma followed the trail, one fragile thread at a time. A junior architect who recalled being pressured to alter blueprints. A secretary who whispered about documents that went missing right before the scandal broke. An accountant who admitted the numbers never added up. Each conversation was like adding a shard to a broken mirror. Slowly, painfully, the full picture began to reflect back. Harrington hadn't just ruined her father. He'd orchestrated it. Carefully, methodically, like a man pruning a tree until only his branches remained. There was anger, of course. White-hot, bone-deep anger. But Emma didn't let it consume her. Not this time. She didn't need fury. She needed precision. If Harrington built his empire on lies, then she would unravel him with the truth piece by piece, until there was nothing left to hide behind. Late nights blurred into mornings. Emma pored over old blueprints, traced signatures with trembling fingers, cross-checked dates that didn't line up. She became a detective in her own life story, chasing ghosts through paper trails and whispered memories. And with each discovery, her father's voice echoed louder, no longer a defeated whisper, but a steady guide. "You're stronger than you know." Emma, don't let them win. One evening, sitting cross-legged on the floor surrounded by documents, she caught herself smiling through the exhaustion. Not because she enjoyed the fight, it was brutal, lonely work, but because for the first time, she felt closer to her father than she had in years. As if he was right there beside her, urging her forward. Still, doubt crept in. What if she was wrong? What if speaking up again only tightened Harrington's grip and left her with nothing but ruined hope? But then she remembered the way he had frozen when she said those words in the restaurant. That momentary crack in his mask. It was proof that he wasn't untouchable. He was afraid of something, and Emma was going to find out what. She kept digging, and with each layer she peeled back, With every lie she exposed, the revenge seeds grew, not wild and reckless, but carefully planted. She wasn't looking to scream her pain into the void anymore. She was building a case, a story that couldn't be ignored, and maybe, just maybe, when it was done, her father's name would rise from the ashes they'd buried it under. But first, she had to finish what she'd started. Daniel Harrington had spent decades crafting an image, polished, untouchable, the kind of billionaire who looked like he'd never broken a sweat in his life. But after that night in the restaurant, after one trembling waitress dared to point at his carefully guarded secret, his empire began to show hairline fractures dotted at first. It was just whispers, the kind that drifted through champagne-soaked cocktail parties and sleek boardrooms. Did you hear Lawson's daughter said the contracts were forged? What if Harrington isn't as clean as he pretends? People brushed it off, laughed even, but the words stuck like grit in a pearl. Once whispered, doubt doesn't die, it grows. Emma could feel the shift. Customers at the restaurant who once looked at her with disdain now watched her with curiosity. She wasn't just the Lawson girl anymore. She was the one who'd stood up to Daniel Harrington. And unlike her father, she didn't disappear. Daniel, of course, tried to laugh it off. Publicly, he doubled down. Interviews where he smirked into the camera, tossing out lines like, "The truth always wins. The weak always blame others," but behind closed doors, cracks widened. His assistants moved faster, his temper shorter, his whiskey glass never far from reach. Emma heard stories trickling in through her father's old colleagues, investors asking questions they never dared before, a board member quietly pulling Emma aside one evening, whispering, "If you have proof, real proof, now's the time. People are nervous. He's not invincible anymore." It wasn't that Daniel's empire collapsed overnight. It was more like the steady dripping of water wearing down stone. Slowly, inevitably, the shine wore off. Emma, meanwhile, refused to back down. She could have stayed silent, let the rumors swirl without adding fuel. But every time she saw her father's slumped shoulders in memory, every time she remembered the way the world branded him a liar, she found her voice again. When asked, she answered plainly, "My father never signed those contracts. I know it. I saw the difference in the handwriting." She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose, and that certainty rattled Harrington more than any headline could, because image was everything to him. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a brand. Investors didn't just buy his products, they bought him. So when the board called emergency meetings and reporters started circling, Daniel's perfect smile began to look a little forced. One night, Emma overheard him in the restaurant again. Yes, he still came, too proud to retreat. He leaned toward a colleague, his voice sharp. "She's nothing. A waitress clinging to a broken man's lies. Do you really think the world will believe her over me? But here's the thing about arrogance, it blinds you." Because while Harrington dismissed her, others were listening. People in his circle, tired of his dominance, now had a reason to question him. And Emma, she didn't need everyone to believe her. Just enough people to start asking, what if? Rumors grew into speculation, speculation into scrutiny. Suddenly, journalists were digging up old contracts, old court filings. Words like fabricated scandal and possible forgery began sneaking into print. His PR team scrambled, releasing statements, arranging photo ops with charities. But no amount of stage smiles could erase the seed of doubt Emma had planted. For years, Harrington had been the one pulling strings in the shadows. Now the spotlight turned, harsh and unflinching. And under that glare, he flinched. Emma didn't celebrate, not yet. She knew rumors weren't justice. But for the first time since her father's fall, she felt the balance tipping. Power wasn't slipping all at once, but piece by piece, Daniel's empire was losing its grip. And the best part, she hadn't shouted, she hadn't threatened. All she had done was tell the truth, again and again, until the cracks became impossible to ignore. The empire Harrington built on lies was starting to crumble, and Emma was just getting started. Do you think Daniel deserves a second chance or total exposure? The truth has a way of surfacing. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes a daughter who refuses to let her father's name rot in silence. For Emma, it came in the form of a dusty folder hidden in a box her dad never had the courage to burn. Drafts of contracts, original sketches, and most importantly, the real signatures. His handwriting, careful and deliberate, side by side with the clumsy forgeries Harrington had passed off as authentic. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was proof. Emma didn't storm into boardrooms. She didn't bang fists on polished oak tables. That wasn't her style. Instead, she slipped the documents into the hands of the right people, journalists who'd been circling the story, colleagues who'd lost jobs when her father fell, even a skeptical board member who'd once told her, "If you've got evidence, bring it." Well, now she had it, and once truth enters the bloodstream of public opinion, it spreads fast. Headlines appeared. Forgery allegations rock Harrington Corp. Whistleblower reveals buried contracts. Within days, Daniel was no longer being introduced as the visionary billionaire. He was the embattled CEO facing questions no amount of charm could deflect. Emma didn't need to say much. In fact, when asked for comment, she only offered one quiet line. "My father was an honest man." This proves it. That was enough. Meanwhile, Daniel scrambled. Press conferences cut short. Stock prices dipping. His smile looked tighter, his voice sharper. The empire he'd spent years polishing suddenly looked like a hollow shell, and the world was finally peering inside. He tried to paint Emma as vindictive, desperate. But each denial only made the evidence stronger. Ironic, isn't it? For years, he thrived on noise, press releases, interviews, endless self-praise. Yet the thing that undid him was silence. Emma's calm refusal to match his volume. She didn't scream. She didn't gloat. She simply laid the truth in front of people and let it speak for itself. And it did. Loudly, board members distanced themselves. Investors withdrew. Old allies turned their backs. The man who once held court in glittering restaurants now found the same rooms unbearably quiet. As for Emma, she didn't look for revenge in the ashes of his downfall. She looked for her father's name, cleared at last. She looked for the relief of knowing the world finally understood who the real liar had been. And I'll tell you what, sometimes the loudest justice doesn't come in roaring crowds or courtroom speeches. It comes in a single sentence. A signature proved authentic. A daughter whispering the truth out loud. Sometimes the loudest justice comes in the quietest words. For years, Emma's father carried the weight of a lie he didn't create. A man who once designed skylines reduced to hiding in the shadows of shame. But the truth, quiet, relentless, has a way of resurfacing. And when it finally did, he stood a little taller. He never got the money back. The contracts were long gone. The clients had moved on. But when neighbors stopped whispering and old colleagues began calling again, offering apologies instead of pity, that mattered more than any paycheck. For the first time in years, people said his name without lowering their voices. Lawson, they said, wasn't the fraud, and the dignity restored piece by piece was priceless. Emma saw it in the way her father smiled again, a smile that reached his eyes. She saw it in how he pulled out his old sketchbooks, flipping through faded pages like he was greeting an old friend. No, he wasn't going back to skyscrapers and high-rises, but he was free from the cage Daniel Harrington had locked him in. His story was no longer defined by shame, it was defined by survival. And that's when Emma realized something important. Revenge was never really about destroying Harrington. Sure, watching him squirm, watching his empire collapse, it was satisfying. She won't deny it. But the real victory? It was giving her father his name back. It was rewriting the ending of a story that had been stolen from him. Because here's the thing. Revenge rooted in anger burns fast. But revenge rooted in truth, that lasts. Emma found her peace not in wealth, not in power, but in resilience. She had faced the man who thought he was untouchable, and she didn't fight him with fists or fury. She fought him with proof, patience, and the courage to speak out when silence would have been easier. And in the end, the world believed her. Daniel Harrington. He became a cautionary tale, a once glittering figure, now remembered as the man who built an empire on lies and watched it crumble under the weight of a waitress's words. Funny, isn't it? The higher they climb, the harder they fall, and sometimes all it takes is the truth to push them over the edge. But Emma's story wasn't about watching him fall. It was about rising again. Her family, though not wealthy, found something wealth could never buy back: pride. She no longer walked into that restaurant with her head bowed. She walked with the quiet confidence of someone who had carried her family through fire and come out stronger. And maybe that's the real heart of it. Justice isn't always a hammer. Sometimes it's a whisper that refuses to be silenced. Emma's whisper was her father's name, and she made sure the world finally heard it. In the end, Emma didn't need fireworks or headlines to feel victorious. Her father's name was cleared. Her family stood tall again. And for the first time in years, she walked through her town without shame trailing behind her. That was the real win. Not wealth, not revenge carved in destruction, just dignity restored and a quiet reminder that the truth, when spoken at the right time, can be louder than any scream. And Daniel, he learned the hard way that lies are fragile things. You can stack them high, polish them, even convince the world they're marble, but the cracks are always there. Sooner or later, the weight of your own deception will pull it all down. And when it does, there's no one left to blame. Emma never needed to shout. She never needed to fight dirty. She let the truth do the heavy lifting. And sometimes, that's the sharpest form of revenge, because here's the lesson: liars may win for a while, but eventually, they trip on the very lies they build their world upon. And when they fall hard. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button. Drop a comment with your thoughts. I'd love to know which moment hit you the hardest. And don't forget to subscribe. These scripts take hours to piece together, and your support is what keeps them alive. Until next time. Remember, justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers.